The gavel came down at 400 hours, Galactic Standard Time, and the chamber went silent. Not the silence of agreement. The silence of something that had just been dropped from a very great height, and no one yet knew what sound it would make when it landed. Ambassador Yuan Jia sat perfectly still in the human delegation seat, third tier, outer ring, the seats given to probationary members, the seats where the acoustics were worst and the lighting was always slightly too dim. She did not stand. She did not speak. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and she watched the vote tally scroll across the chamber's central display, and she did not let her face do anything at all. The tally read 214 in favor, 3 abstentions, 1 against. The 1 against was Earth. What the Galactic Senate did not notice. What none of the 214 voting species noticed, because they were already turning to each other with the particular satisfied energy of civilizations that have just completed administrative unpleasantness, was that Yuan Jia's left hand, hidden beneath the desk, had been pressing a single button on her personal communicator for the last 47 seconds. A button she had held down every second since the vote began. A button connected to a frequency that had no official registration in the Senate's communication logs. She held it for 3 more seconds after the gavel fell. Then she released it. Then she stood, gathered her materials with unhurried precision, and walked out of the chamber without a single backward glance, which was, to those few who noticed, somehow more unsettling than if she had screamed. The first mystery: what signal had she sent? To whom? And why had she started sending it before the vote was even complete, as if the outcome had never been in question? The second: the human delegation had known this vote was coming for 11 days. 11 days during which they had made no counterarguments, filed no procedural objections, called in no political favors from any of the 12 species who owed Earth diplomatic debts. They had simply waited. A civilization that had argued every single point of its Senate admission for 6 years, that had negotiated the specific wording of 17 separate treaty clauses down to individual syllables, had watched its own exile coming and done nothing. Which raised the third mystery, the one that would not fully crystallize for another 53 minutes. Why, in the 11 days between the vote's announcement and its execution, had every single human commercial shipping contract in the galaxy been quietly, legally, and completely reassigned? Senator Vetharon of the Davari Collective was the first to find something wrong, though he would not have described it that way. He would have described it as a minor irregularity. He was very good at calling things minor irregularities. He found it 14 minutes after Yuan Jia left the chamber, while reviewing the automatic trade flow projections that the Senate's economic systems generated after every major political event. Standard procedure. Routine. The projections showed a gap. Not a disruption. Not a spike. A gap, a clean, rectangular absence in the flow of goods across 17 shipping lanes that had the geometric precision of something deliberately removed rather than accidentally missing. He called up the originating contracts, found them all reassigned, found the reassignment timestamps, staggered across 11 days, each one filed correctly, each one within legal parameters, each one individually unremarkable. Together, they formed a pattern that made his secondary respiratory organs constrict. He opened a channel to his aide. Get me the full human commercial portfolio, everything. Transit contracts, supply agreements, emergency distribution, all of it. Senator, that's approximately everything. The aide returned in 4 minutes. Vetharon spent the next 9 minutes reading, and the expression that formed on his face was one that his species reserved for moments of genuine cognitive difficulty. The expression of a mind confronting something that does not fit the expected shape of the world. He reached for his communicator to call the Senate chair. His communicator showed him a notification he had not seen before. The emergency medical supply chain for the outer reach stations had been serviced exclusively by human carriers for the past 3 years. Past tense. Across the station, in the human delegation's suite, a suite they were now being asked to vacate within 6 hours, per Senate exile protocol, a young man named Corporal Davy Reyes was doing something that looked, to the 2 Senate security officers watching through the door's observation panel, like nothing important. He was making coffee. Not synthesized coffee, not the nutrient-equivalent protein solution that most species serve to humans as diplomatic courtesy. Real coffee, from a small manual press he had apparently carried here in his personal luggage, with grounds that filled the corridor with a smell that neither security officer had a classification for. One officer, a threll, 6-limbed, with sensory clusters that could parse chemical composition from ambient air, tilted her head and said quietly to her partner, "What is that?" "Human ritual preparation," the other said. He had reviewed the cultural briefings. "It precedes significant events or decisions." The threll officer watched Corporal Reyes press the coffee slowly, methodically, without any apparent urgency, despite the fact that his species had just been removed from the most powerful political body in the known galaxy. "He does not appear distressed." "No," said her partner. Then, after a pause, "He does not." Neither of them could have articulated why this bothered them more than distress would have. The coffee was important. Not symbolically, actually, materially important, but that explanation was still 51 minutes away. What was happening right now, in the 17 minutes since Gia had walked out of the Senate chamber, was a cascade of small events that each appeared unrelated, each appeared minor, and which were together assembling themselves into something that no one in the Senate had a word for yet, because nothing like it had ever been done before. In Sector 7 of the station's logistics hub, 3 human cargo handlers quietly completed their shifts, clocked out with perfect documentation, and boarded the next shuttle home. In the station's primary medical wing, a human pharmacist named Dr. Elan Cho submitted her resignation, effective immediately, as per her contract's emergency exit clause, which she had apparently negotiated into her agreement 2 years ago, and which Human Resources had approved without reading the specific triggering conditions. She left her access codes neatly labeled on the desk, along with a handwritten note that said, "Synthesis protocols for items 7 through 31 are in the blue binder. You'll want to start on the Vetherin compound tonight. It has a 72-hour prep window." No one read the note for another 22 minutes. In the Senate's primary communication relay, the one that routed 34% of intersector emergency signals, a maintenance contract expired. The renewal had been scheduled for automated processing. The account that funded the automated processing had been, 11 days ago, quietly reclassified as inactive, pending the resolution of the human delegation's diplomatic status. The contract did not renew. The relay did not notice for another 40 minutes. Relays do not notice things. They simply stop working. Gia was in the elevator when her communicator finally accepted an incoming call. She looked at the identifier, let it ring twice, then answered. "Secretary Nakamura," she said. "It passed," said the voice on the other end. Not a question. 214-1. A pause and the signal. 47 seconds before the gavel. They voted faster than I expected. Faster, interesting. Another pause, thoughtful, not distressed. The timestamp will be clean. The timestamp will be exactly what it needs to be, she said. The elevator opened. She stepped out into a corridor that still had her name on the access registry, for now. We have, I'd estimate, 50 to 55 minutes before the first call comes in. Our teams are ready. I know, she started walking. Make sure the Kefari know about the pharmaceutical gap first. They'll panic, which is appropriate, and it'll reach the Senate faster than anything official. Already done. And the transit corridor, the Vetherin run. 17 hours to critical. She stopped walking just for a moment. That's shorter than we modeled. Ewan, the voice was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from having done the calculations very many times. We knew it would be shorter. That's why we built in the margin. The margin assumes they call within 90 minutes. They'll call within 60. She started walking again. I know, she said, and ended the call. The Galactic Senate had exiled humanity on several grounds. The official documentation, 340 pages, which the human delegation had been given 11 days to review, cited 17 separate violations, ranging from unauthorized planetary development in contested zones to what the Davari formally described as psychological destabilization of diplomatic proceedings, which was a sophisticated way of saying that humans had, on 6 separate occasions, introduced arguments that no species had anticipated and which had produced outcomes that took months to mathematically reconstruct. The Senate had been building toward this vote for 2 years. 2 years of procedural maneuvering, of coalition building, of the particular slow political music that galaxy-spanning governments play when they want to do something and want to feel justified while doing it. What the Senate had not done in those 2 years was examine what humanity actually did. Not what humanity argued, not what humanity claimed in its diplomatic submissions. What it did, the contracts it held, the routes it ran, the specific, unglamorous, load-bearing functions it had quietly accumulated over 8 years of Senate membership, not through grand negotiation, but through the simple mechanism of showing up, being reliable, and accepting the contracts that larger and more prestigious civilizations found beneath their dignity. Senator Vetherin had now been starring at the full human commercial portfolio for 11 minutes. He looked up from his display, found his aide standing in the doorway, and said, "How many species have emergency pharmaceutical supply agreements with human carriers?" The aide checked, 41, Senator. Of those 41, how many have alternate supply chains capable of meeting their minimum emergency thresholds? A longer pause, 11. Vetherin set down his display. What about the communication relays, the maintenance contracts? I need to pull those separately. Pull them. He stood and walked to the window while his aide worked. The station's exterior showed the standard traffic of a functioning galactic hub, ships arriving, departing, the constant arterial flow of commerce and communication. It all looked normal. It looked normal the way a body looks normal before you understand that something inside it has already stopped. 31 minutes after the gavel, the Kefari ambassador's office received a routine medical supply update, the kind of automated notification that came through daily and was almost never read by the ambassador personally. Today, an aide read it. The aide read it twice. Then the aide ran to the ambassador's office and interrupted a meeting with 3 different senators, which was not done, and which the aide did not care about, because the notification had contained a phrase that the aide's training had flagged as a Tier 1 emergency. Supply continuity cannot be guaranteed beyond current inventory. The Kefari home system had a medical condition affecting approximately 14% of its population that required a synthesized compound available from exactly 2 sources in the known galaxy. One source was 17 transit days away. The other was human-controlled. When does their current inventory run out? The ambassador said. Current models suggest. The aide checked the figure twice. 19 days if consumption holds at present rates. And the human contract expired as of another check 47 minutes ago. The ambassador looked at the 3 senators in his office. The senators looked at each other. That can't be right, one of them said. The contract would have had a renewal clause. It did, said the aide. The renewal required the human delegation to be in active Senate membership status. No one said anything for a moment. "Get me the Senate chair," the ambassador said. "No, get me the chair's chief of staff. The chair will be managing 17 other crises in the next." He checked the time. 20 minutes. Get me someone who can actually move. He was not wrong about the 17 crises. In the 40 minutes since the exile vote, the Senate's administrative systems had generated 2,300 individual flags, automated alerts from contracts, protocols, agreements, and maintenance schedules that had listed human delegation status as a condition of operation. The Senate's administrative team had not known the number would be 2,300. They had estimated, in their pre-vote impact modeling, that human exile might generate minimal short-term administrative disruption and moderate long-term renegotiation requirements. The impact modeling had not been wrong exactly. It had been wrong in the way that a map is wrong when the mapmaker has never actually visited the territory. The humans had never announced themselves as essential. They had never lobbied for recognition as load-bearing members of the galactic infrastructure. They had, in fact, been frequently characterized by Davari economists, by Threll political commentators, by the popular consensus of 17 civilizations, as minor players, energetic, occasionally useful, sometimes disruptive, ultimately peripheral to the Senate's real function. The humans had never corrected this characterization. The flags kept coming. This is where the story changes shape. Because the Senate was now operating under a fundamental misunderstanding, one so complete, so architecturally embedded in their assumptions, that correcting it would require them to reconstruct not just what they knew about humans, but how they had processed every interaction with them for 8 years. The misunderstanding was this. The Senate had believed that humanity's value was in its arguments, in its political voice, in its vote and its presence and its occasionally maddening tendency to introduce unexpected factors into settled debates. The Senate had voted to remove that voice. What they had not understood, what, in retrospect, was obvious, in the particular way that obvious things become obvious only after they have already cost you something, was that the voice had never been the point. The point was the work. The quiet, unglamorous, logistically intricate work of a species that had arrived in galactic space with no particular technological advantage, no ancient alliances, no territory worth coveting, and had therefore done what humans did when confronted with a system that didn't particularly want them, found the gaps, filled them, made themselves, slowly and without announcement, structurally indispensable. Not through diplomacy, through showing up. Every cycle, every route, every contract that the Davari considered beneath them and the Threll considered inefficient and the Kefari hadn't thought to look for. The humans had looked for it, quoted a price, and delivered. On time, in full, with a follow-up message that said simply, anything else you need. Senator Vetharon's aide had now pulled the communication relay data. She was standing in the doorway again, and the expression on her face was the one that had no official classification in Davari emotional taxonomy, because Davari were not supposed to look afraid. They were a civilization 4,000 years older than humanity. They had seen empires form and dissolve. They had outlasted species that once commanded 100 worlds. The aide said, "Senator, the primary relay in Sector 9. "What about it?" "The maintenance contract. It expired at 4:01 this morning." Vetharon checked the time. It was now 4:42, 41 minutes ago. "Yes." And no one flagged it. It was in the automated renewal queue. The account that funded automated renewals was linked to the human delegation's operational status. "I understand the mechanism." He was already crossing to his desk. "What routes does the Sector 9 relay service?" She told him. He sat down. The Sector 9 relay was not the most important communication node in the station. It was not glamorous infrastructure. It was the kind of thing that operated in the background, that you only thought about when it stopped working, that appeared on no political maps and in no diplomatic briefings because it was simply there. The way gravity was simply there. The way atmosphere was simply there. The way things that keep you alive tend to be simply there until suddenly they are not. The Sector 9 relay serviced the emergency distress channel for the entire outer cluster. How long before the relay systems noticed the contract gap and shut down? Vetheron asked. The aide had already calculated it. She had been hoping the answer would be different than it was. 17 minutes. He called the Senate chair directly. This was unusual. The Senate chair received communications through a layered system of aides and filters designed to ensure that only information of genuine urgency reached her directly. Vetheron bypassed every layer, and the chair answered on the third signal, which told him she had already been fielding other calls, which told him he was not alone in what he had found. Yuanjia, she said without preamble, where is she? I don't know. Is she still on the station? Departure logs show the human delegation shuttle has not left the dock. She is still on the station. A pause, find her. Madam Chair, the Sector 9 relay. I know about the relay. I know about the pharmaceutical contracts and the Keferi supply chain and the 17 other items my office has received in the last 9 minutes. Find Ambassador Yuan. He found her 22 minutes later. She was in the station's secondary observation deck, a public area, accessible to any species, with a broad viewport that showed the star field and the traffic of the surrounding space lanes. She was sitting in a chair, facing the viewport, with a cup of what he recognized as the substance from the cultural briefings, coffee, the ritual preparation. And she was, by all external indicators, relaxed. Vetheron stood for a moment in the entrance to the observation deck. 3 of his aides were behind him. He was aware of a sensation that his species associated with encountering a superior predator. Not fear, exactly, but the body's urgent memo to the brain that it has made a miscalculation. He walked toward her. She heard him coming, the deck was quiet, his footsteps were not, and she turned her head without standing, without the formal acknowledgement that his rank technically demanded, and she said, Senator, I was wondering which one of you would come personally. He sat down across from her, which surprised both of them. He thought he had planned to remain standing. Ambassador Yuan, he said, we have a situation. Do you? He studied her, 8 years of Senate membership. He had voted to exile her species 11 hours ago in the preliminary confirmation session, and now he was sitting in a public observation lounge asking for what exactly? He had not formulated the specific request. He had come because the Senate chair told him to come. He was realizing, seated here, that he did not know what the next word was. The Sector 9 relay, he said. I heard about that, she said. 17 minutes to shutdown as of, she checked something on her communicator, 23 minutes ago, so 4 minutes give or take. It can be stopped. Yes, she said, by the maintenance contractor. She met his eyes. Who is no longer a Senate member in good standing and is therefore not authorized to access Senate systems. The silence was of a specific quality, not empty silence. The silence of a sentence that hasn't ended yet. The exile resolution, she continued, was very thorough. Section 11, paragraph 4. Upon exile, all operational access for the exiled party is revoked immediately. You wrote that language. The Davari delegation proposed it, specifically to prevent the what was the phrase, ongoing interference of exiled parties in Senate operational continuity. She sipped her coffee. It was very well drafted. Vetheron said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't begin. We did not think. The relay, he finally managed. People could die. Something crossed Yuanjia's face, not satisfaction, nothing that simple, but the expression of a person confronting the exact moment they had prepared for. Yes, she said quietly. They could, which is why I would strongly recommend the Senate chair request an emergency reinstatement of human operational access within the next, she checked again, 3 minutes. That would require a floor vote. There is an emergency protocol. Article 7, Section 2, allows the chair to grant provisional operational access to any party during an active safety crisis without a floor vote. It requires only her signature. She held his gaze. She has the article number. I sent it to her office 40 seconds ago. The provisional authorization came through, with 90 seconds to spare. The Sector 9 relay did not shut down. No one on the outer cluster lost emergency communication access. No one died because of a gap in the distress channel. The crisis, which would be described in internal Senate memos as a brief administrative irregularity, was resolved efficiently, cleanly, and without public incident. This should have felt like a victory. Instead, every senator who knew what had happened spent the next 4 hours in a state of mounting unease that none of them could fully articulate. Because the relay had been saved, yes, but the saving of it had required them to do something unprecedented. Something that established, in clean legal language, in a document that would be in the Senate's permanent record, a fact that no one had wanted to formally acknowledge. Humanity's exile had created an active safety crisis within 1 hour. 1 hour. The Senate had spent 2 years building the case for exile. They had modeled the impact. They had consulted their economists, their logisticians, their diplomatic analysts. They had determined that removal of the human delegation would cause minimal short-term disruption. The disruption had not waited for the short term. Senator Vetheron returned to the observation deck 3 hours later. Gia was still there. He stood at the viewport for a moment before he spoke. Outside, the traffic moved as it always moved, ships arriving and departing, the regular pulse of a station that believed it was functioning normally. But he had spent the last 3 hours reviewing the full human commercial portfolio, and he now understood that the traffic outside was not what he had believed it to be. Perhaps a third of those ships were human contracted. Perhaps a third of the goods moving through this station were moving because of agreements that humans had negotiated, routes that humans had established, schedules that humans maintained with the obsessive punctuality that the Davari had always found slightly baffling. Because why would a species care so much about being on time? It was not strategic. It was not logical. It was simply something they did. He thought he understood it now. How long? He asked. He did not specify what he meant. He suspected she would understand. How long had we been building toward this? She said. Yes. The first major contract was 8 years ago. The relay maintenance agreement was 6. The pharmaceutical supply chains, the longer ones, the ones that would take more than a few weeks to transition, those took about 4 years to establish. She was quiet for a moment. We didn't plan it as a strategy, not at first. It was just work that needed doing, and we could do it, so we did. And later. A pause, not evasion, consideration. Later, she said, we understood what we had built. And yes, when the exile proceedings began, we made sure the work was structured in a way that would make the consequences visible quickly. The reassigned contracts were reassigned to human carriers operating under independent registry, she confirmed. Still human, still running the routes. The work doesn't stop, but the Senate authorization is no longer there, he finished. Which means, she said, that you need us back. He turned from the viewport. She was watching him with an expression that was not triumph and not anger, something more tired than either and more serious. He thought, for the first time in 8 years of watching human delegates in Senate chambers, that he was actually seeing one. There will be conditions, he said. There always are, she said. Write them down, we'll read them. The emergency reinstatement session convened at 6:31 hours, Galactic Standard Time, 87 minutes after the exile vote had been finalized. The chamber that had been silent with satisfaction 2 hours ago was now silent with a different quality. The silence of 214 civilizations doing the specific mathematics of how badly they had miscalculated and arriving at answers they did not like. Senator Vetharon moved the emergency reinstatement resolution. It passed 214-0. The human delegation seat, third tier, outer ring, the seat with bad acoustics and dim lighting, was formally re-entered into the Senate registry at 6:34 hours. At 6:35, Gia walked back into the chamber. She walked to the third tier. She sat in the outer ring. She opened her materials. She adjusted the lighting. She had always found it slightly too dim, and she had never bothered to request a change before. Because there were larger fights, and you chose your moments. Today she requested a maintenance adjustment. The maintenance team came within 4 minutes. They were, as it happened, human contractors. The light got better. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a simple reversal. It was not the Senate humbly apologizing and humanity graciously accepting. Nothing about any of it was clean. The conditions of reinstatement included 17 renegotiated clauses, which the human delegation read word by word, negotiating individual syllables, as they always had. The Senate's Economic Modeling Division was quietly restructured to include human commercial data as primary input, which was technically an administrative reform, and not officially, an acknowledgement that they had simply not been looking at the right numbers. The formal impact assessment, the one that tried to calculate what would have happened if the emergency reinstatement had not occurred, was classified at the highest Senate security level, because its conclusions were embarrassing in a way that transcended politics and entered the territory of civilizational humility. The document calculated, based on cascading contract failures, supply chain gaps, and communication relay dependencies, that full collapse of human-maintained systems would have caused measurable harm across 41 species within 72 hours, with serious humanitarian consequences for 11 of those species within 3 weeks. The document remained classified for 6 months. Gia obtained a copy on the second day. She read it alone in her suite on the station, the suite she had been asked to vacate and had not vacated, because the provisional authorization had stopped that particular clock, and no one had officially told her to leave again. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the viewport and sat with it for a long time, because the document contained a truth she had worked toward for years and had known was true in the abstract. And there was a significant difference between knowing something and seeing it printed in classified Senate type, and understanding that 214 civilizations now knew it too. She had not felt powerful when the vote came down. She had felt the specific human feeling of being underestimated by people who are confident and wrong, and the related human feeling of having worked very hard for a very long time toward a moment you hoped would never be necessary. It had been necessary. She was not sure how she felt about that. Corporal Davy Reyes found her there, sitting with the classified document, in the dim suite that was finally getting a maintenance upgrade on its lighting. He knocked on the open door frame. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was either habit or intuition, and Gia thought it was probably both, which was a very human thing for it to be. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. He set down the second cup. He looked at the document she'd put face down on the table between them and didn't ask what it was. The Kefari ambassador sent a message, he said. Personal, not official. He said, Reyes paused, seemed to be finding the words. He said he didn't understand us before. He said he thought he did and he didn't. No, Gia agreed. Is that, he stopped again. Was this always how it was going to go? She thought about it honestly. We knew what would happen if they exiled us and we did nothing. We knew what we'd built. But she picked up the coffee, the part where it worked, that part you never really know. You keep building and you stay reliable and you hold the contracts they don't want and run the routes they won't run, and you hope that when the moment comes. It's enough. That it's enough, she confirmed. They sat with that. Outside, the station traffic moved. A human carrier executed a docking approach on lane 7, on time, to the second, the way it always was. A Davari freight vessel was queued behind it, waiting, as it always did, because the human carriers were always faster in the approach sequence, and no one had ever published a study on why, because the answer was boring. They simply practiced more. There is a transcript in the Galactic Senate's permanent record, the session of the emergency reinstatement, 6:31 hours, that most historians have treated as administrative. A procedural reversal, a political course correction, the kind of thing that governments do when they have made a mistake and need to unmake it. But there is a secondary document, not classified, simply overlooked, from the same session. The session's audio log, which captures everything said within the chamber, including the ambient sounds of 214 delegations preparing for an emergency vote at an hour when most of them would rather have been anywhere else. At timestamp 0633, 43 seconds before the vote was finalized, a microphone in the Davari section picked up a quiet conversation between two junior aides. One said, "They let the relay almost fail on purpose." The other said, "No, they let us almost fail, there's a difference." A pause. "Why would they do that?" Another pause, longer. "I think," the second voice said slowly, "I think they were showing us something they couldn't just say." The vote was called. It passed 214 to 0. And somewhere in the third tier, outer ring, where the acoustics were worst and the light was finally adequately bright, Ambassador Yuan Jia cast humanity's vote, the only vote that did not require any discussion among her delegation, did not require any calculation, did not require the review of any model or the consultation of any analyst. She voted yes, to return to a Senate that had exiled her, to re-enter a system that had decided, by a margin of 214 to 1, that her species did not belong, to sit in the bad seat, in the outer ring, in the dim light that was now finally better, and keep working. Senator Vetharon wrote a private memo that evening, personal, not filed with the Senate's official record, never intended for distribution. He was a disciplined administrator, and disciplined administrators write things down when they need to understand them, because the act of writing is an act of confronting. The memo was 3 sentences. It read, "We exiled them because we believed they were not essential. We were wrong in a way that could have cost us lives. But the thing I cannot resolve, the thing I will not sleep easily with, is that they knew. They knew before the vote. They had known for years, and they stayed anyway. They kept the routes running. They kept the relays maintained. They kept the supply chains moving for species that didn't know their names and wouldn't have thanked them. They did the work that no one watched for years, without acknowledgement, without status, without any guarantee that any of it would ever matter. I am 4,000 years older than their civilization. I have watched empires fall. I have seen species that commanded fleets and built wonders lose everything when they believed they were irreplaceable. I have never, in 4,000 years, seen a species make themselves genuinely irreplaceable by doing the work that no one else would do, quietly, reliably, for as long as it took. I don't know what to call that. My language doesn't have the word for it. I suspect theirs does. The word, in humanity's language, is not a diplomatic term. It is not a strategic concept. It is not found in any political science textbook or galactic relations manual. It is a very old word, from very old languages, And it means something that translates poorly across species boundaries, because most species do not have the specific historical experience that made the word necessary. The word is perseverance, which sounds in translation like patience. But it isn't. It is what happens when a civilization has been told, repeatedly by history, by circumstance, by the accumulated weight of everyone who ever doubted them, that they cannot, and they keep going anyway. Not because they are certain of the outcome, not because the logic guarantees success, not because any rational model of the universe supports the decision to continue. Because they have decided. Because the work is there to be done. Because showing up, one more time, is the only answer they know how to give. The Galactic Senate reinstated humanity at 6:34 hours. By 6:35, they were already back at work. They did not celebrate.